Welcome back to another one of your Flip Lectures. Today we're going to talk about the beginning of the Second World War from 1936 to 1940. We've already talked about a couple of the conditions for the war, the rise of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, but now we're going to talk about the Soviet Union and the rise of Imperial Japan. We already learned about the Soviet Union in the First World War, but let's review for a second. First off, the Soviet Union is a totalitarian communist government in which the state is going to control all property and all aspects of society. It comes from the revolution in 1917, and the Bolsheviks in the Civil War under Lenin take over and declare the Soviet Union. But Vladimir Lenin dies in 1924, and there is a battle over who is going to be his successor. Leon Trotsky was expected to be the next leader. Lenin had picked him, but lurking behind him was Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin was a high-ranking member of the Communist Party who was particularly known for his ruthless attitude. His code name when he was a revolutionary was Stalin, meaning steel. And Lenin doesn't really trust Stalin, quoted as saying, "I am not sure that Comrade Stalin will always use his power properly." And Vladimir Lenin put that in his will. So it was meant to be read after he died to try to discourage people to making Stalin his successor upon his death. But Stalin is very crafty, and he's very violent and loyal. He has a lot of loyal followers. And so, as soon as Lenin dies, all of Stalin's followers kind of go into action. And so Joseph Stalin systematically and often violently eliminates all of his rivals. He uses political pressures to get people to support him, intimidation tactics, even assassination. And once Joseph Stalin rises to the head of the Communist Party, he essentially is going to rule as a dictator. So in a lot of ways, Joe Stalin's regime is just as, if not more, repressive than the Nazis. And so when we talk about, is this a communist country? Well, it is, but it's also a totalitarian dictatorship. And to kind of give you a story about Joseph Stalin and kind of inform the decisions he's going to make during the war, I want to talk about Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky had actually left Russia. He was exiled by Joseph Stalin during the Civil War. And Trotsky had been hiding in Mexico, kind of trying to live out the rest of his life. But Stalin wanted Trotsky dead so badly that he sent his people all over the world looking for Leon Trotsky. They found him in Mexico, and Stalin's assassins killed Trotsky in Mexico, proving that Joe Stalin would go around the world in order to eliminate his rivals. And Stalin's Soviet Union is a cult of personality dictatorship. It is totalitarian. And in the 1930s, he carries out a series of events known as the Great Purges. Stalin is paranoid that people are trying to overthrow him, that people are threatening him. And so the use of the secret police and the military by Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union was used to basically mass arrest and execute anyone who was considered to be kind of against Joseph Stalin, a dissident, an opposition type of person. He also went back through history, and he erased all of his former rivals from important photographs. The one you see on the right, Leon Trotsky is giving a salute, and in the next picture he is gone. So Joseph Stalin literally rewrites history in order to serve his means. And the result of all of these great purges is about 10 to 30 million Russians and other Soviets are going to be sent to gulags, and about 20 million Soviets are actually going to die. And these purges were quite literally just executions of anyone who was suspected of not being loyal or of being in opposition to Joseph Stalin. And these gulags were basically work camps in the most harsh parts of Russia, such as Siberia, in which you would be sent to work and you couldn't even really escape, because if you did escape, there's nowhere to go to. But the results of a lot of these gulags was mass deaths, executions, and in a lot of ways the Soviet Union is even more totalitarian than Nazi Germany. And I always like kind of giving a couple of Stalin quotes. Quotable Stalin, who said, "The death of one man is a tragedy, but the death of millions is just a statistic." He also said, "Death solves all problems. No man, no problem." And so when we think about this war and the Soviet Union's participation in it, always bear in mind that Russia is led by Joseph Stalin, and bear in mind also the lengths he is willing to go to hang on to his power. Now we need to turn our attention to Asia and to Imperial Japan, the country that is going to bring the United States ultimately into the Second World War. And in Japan, they have a very long history of having a fierce devotion to an emperor. Around this time, the emperor's name is Hirohito. Technically, Japan was a democracy, with the emperor as kind of the head of state. But in 1931, military generals, without the approval of the democracy, invaded Manchuria and began a campaign of conquest. This signaled to everyone in the country that it was now the military who was in charge. And so by 1932, Hirohito, along with his military generals, basically become the authoritarian, totalitarian leaders of Japan. And in Japan, there's a very intense sense of nationalism. And during this time, the military leaders and the emperor bring back the idea of Bushido, the samurai code, Japanese militarism, that is going to mix kind of these traditional ways of thinking and devotion and culture with modern technology. And this is going to be used by these leaders to justify the very totalitarian government run by the emperor, as well as an intense campaign of expansionism and invasions of mainland Asia, many of which are going to result in some of the worst atrocities of the war. And if we kind of take a look at Japan, it's not a very big landmass. So in order to increase their resources, farmland, other things that they needed, Japan very quickly began invading Manchuria, Korea, China, and other places in the 1930s, signaling to the entire world that Japan was an expansionist state and someone to be feared. And here are pictures of Japanese soldiers walking along the Great Wall of China, and you can see these citizens wearing gas masks during the invasion of Manchuria. So in this sense, the Second World War will truly be a world war. And so the stage at this point is set. There are totalitarian regimes bent on expansion, and so conflicts are going to become inevitable. The first of these conflicts was the Spanish Civil War that is going to take place in Spain beginning in 1936. Francisco Franco was the leader of a group of revolutionaries who were seeking to overthrow the government, which was a government of elected communists and socialists. Francisco Franco is a fascist, and he wants to be the fascist dictator. And so the Spaniards fight a civil war against each other. But communist regime of the Soviet Union, as well as Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, see this as an opportunity to use their new technology to test it out and to provide aid to one side of the conflict or another. And the Spanish Civil War becomes an international news story. In a lot of ways, kind of the effects of this can still be felt today. A lot of people come from countries all over the world to fight in it. And in fact, 2,800 Americans, calling themselves the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, actually go to Spain in order to fight against the spread of fascism and fight, they say, to protect democracy. Pablo Picasso, after the bombing of the city of Guernica, paints a very, very famous mural, and he refuses to allow it to return to Spain until the man responsible, Francisco Franco, for the bombing of Guernica was dead. Now we have to turn our gaze back to Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. And once Nazi Germany rearms in the 1930s, they begin their campaign of expansion. They have a very large and modern military, perhaps the most powerful in the world at the time. And there was an area of Germany that they were not allowed to have soldiers in. You can look on the map, it's called the Rhineland. Now the Rhineland is on the border with France and Belgium. And the idea was if Germany couldn't have any military in the Rhineland, then it would be easier for France, Belgium to defend themselves in the event of any sort of war. This was a part of the Treaty of Versailles, that they were not allowed to have this military there. But in 1936, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis simply moved their army into the Rhineland. And neither Britain nor France are willing to intervene and enforce the terms of the treaty. They are still too afraid after World War I to provoke a second world war. And so this first little aggression is going to be the first test of France and Britain. And Germany is going to begin testing them even further. And so Nazi Germany, in their 25 points, talks about wanting to unify all German people. And so they come up with an idea called Lebensraum, which means living space, living room. And so the Nazis then look at the surrounding areas, and they try to consolidate all people they consider part of the German race. So this begins in 1938, when the Nazis threatened to invade the country of Austria, which has a very close, similar culture to Germany, and in fact, Hitler is actually Austrian. And so Austria agrees to vote on the unification. But democracy is tricky. Austria might vote against joining Germany. So the Nazi military simply invaded the country and declared unification. So by 1938, Germany now included the entire country of Austria. So now, this is what Germany looks like, everything in green. And so the Germans set their sights on another piece of land, a place called the Sudetenland, which is an area of Czechoslovakia that borders Germany, with a lot of people who speak the German language and have German culture. But Czechoslovakia was not willing to give this territory up. They told the Nazis that they would not give it up, and France, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union all pledged to back up the Czechoslovakians against German aggression. But before any of that happened, there was a major conference called at Munich in order to try to avoid the start of a Second World War. And at this meeting were the major leaders of Germany, France, Great Britain, and Italy. And at the Munich conference, these leaders met face to face. But Czechoslovakia was not really involved in these negotiations. They don't really get a say. Great Britain and France are going to negotiate on their behalf. And the British leader is the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who will become infamous in history for what he is about to do. And so in 1938, in order to try to avoid war, France and Great Britain decide to give in to Hitler's demands, and they tell Czechoslovakia to give up the Rhineland. This policy of giving Hitler what he wanted to try to avoid war was known as appeasement. And it comes from two ideas. The first is a fear of war after the horrors of the First World War, and the second is the belief that Hitler's expansion would ultimately be limited if he got Austria and the Sudetenland. And so Neville Chamberlain, returning to England with the Munich Agreement, put it up in front of all of the cameras to see and told England that he had secured peace in our time. But that peace would be short-lived, as you're going to find. Around the world, this idea of appeasement was met with a lot of criticism. Dr. Seuss, a sometimes political cartoonist, drew this cartoon, showing Neville Chamberlain in the middle as the appeaser with all of the many heads of the Nazi war machine looking to devour him. Remember one lollipop, then you all go home. So he's trying to point out that this is probably not the best strategy. You also have this idea of Neville Chamberlain walking along a tightrope. The reason he's carrying an umbrella is because that was like his signature thing. He always carried an umbrella. And you see the tightrope is about to fall with Neville Chamberlain trying to appease all of these military countries. Finally, you have this one, with the Nazi tiger devouring Neville Chamberlain and his umbrella. And so France and Great Britain tell Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudetenland. But just a year later, the Nazis are actually going to invade and conquer all of Czechoslovakia, in violation of the Munich Agreement that was just brokered and was supposed to bring peace for our time. And once again, France and Great Britain do nothing, fearing bringing on a Second World War. And here's a picture of the German invasion of Czechoslovakia. And so on top of all this, on top of Czechoslovakia and Austria, now the Nazis are going to demand even more Lebensraum, Poland. And Poland was a recent country. It was created after the First World War, and there was a city called Danzig that was on the Baltic Sea that was really important because it was on the water. Nazi Germany demanded that whole area of Poland that kind of separated the two parts of Germany needed to be returned. Poland refused, and at this point, Great Britain and France agreed to intervene militarily to help Poland if the Nazis invaded. And so 3 years of appeasement had gotten Great Britain and France nowhere and had only strengthened Hitler's position in Europe. But in order for Germany to conquer Poland, they had one serious problem. And that was on the other side, there was the giant, powerful Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. And so before Hitler is going to invade Poland, He doesn't want to bring the Soviets into the war. And so Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler are going to sign a non-aggression pact, which Soviet Union pledges to stay out of any war that happens with Poland, and Germany says that they will agree to carve up Eastern Europe between those two countries. And so the Soviet Union actually will invade Poland around the same time that the Germans will. But the German military in 1939 is going to move into position to finally invade Poland. But one political cartoonist was a little bit cynical about this, a little bit skeptical, and he wasn't sure how long the honeymoon between these two totalitarian leaders could possibly last. And at this point you may be asking yourself, where is the United States in all of this? Traditionally in our world today, the United States really gets involved if things like this are happening. But during this time, isolationism is the prevailing American foreign policy. They wanted to avoid alliances after World War I, after that mistake, and so they basically tried to stay out of any wars and conflicts that did not directly threaten the country. To ensure that the United States would stay out of any European conflict, the United States passed two Neutrality Acts in 1935 and 37. The first one made it illegal for the United States to sell any military supplies to a country at war. And the second one in 1937 said that any nation that was at war must do something called cash and carry. Pay for it in cash, no credit, and provide transportation for any trade they wanted to do, including non-military trade. And the goal of this was so that no American ships or Americans would die, thus drawing the United States into the war. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted the United States to pursue a policy of internationalism. And he's an internationalist, and what you believe is that trade and diplomacy helps prevent wars, that the United States, as a powerful trading nation, should do their part to preserve world peace. But the majority of Americans disagree with Roosevelt, and so Roosevelt is kind of forced by public opinion to keep neutral policies towards the nations that are going to go to war. And the Second World War is going to start on September 1st of 1939, when Nazi forces roll over the border into Poland and begin the conquest of that country. Shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union also invaded Poland from the other side, living up to their part of the bargain that they would carve up Eastern Europe with the Nazis once the war was won. And the new German tactic became known as the Blitzkrieg, or the Lightning War. And it's here where all the technological advances of the 20th century are put on full display. No one had ever seen warfare that was so fast and so devastating. High-powered airplanes in large numbers, fast, powerful tanks that could roll over any terrain, and even motorized vehicles for soldiers all contributed to Nazi Germany very quickly being able to demolish and conquer Poland in only 35 days. Great Britain and France did declare war on Germany, but they were unable to get to Poland in time to help them. And so at this point, the alliances form. Germany allies with Italy and the Empire of Japan, and Great Britain and France form the Allied powers, along with smaller countries like Poland, China, and Norway. In 1940, the war escalates even further. The Nazis invade Northern Europe, conquering Norway and Denmark. And in May, the Nazi military planned to invade France. And so by this point, the Nazis are starting to pour into much of Europe. Now, France had been paranoid about a potential German invasion after the First World War, and so they had built a very strong line of fortifications known as the Maginot Line. As you see on the map, the Maginot Line only covers the border with Germany. The Maginot Line itself was pretty impenetrable. It was a very strong fortification. But the Nazis simply go around the Maginot Line by going through Belgium and Luxembourg and going around the Maginot Line into France. And so because of this, Allied soldiers are going to end up being trapped in Belgium and northern France, and the Nazis are going to very easily roll through that country. And here's kind of a picture of that German invasion. Now the war maybe ends very quickly, if not for something known as the miracle at Dunkirk. And what happened is that Allied soldiers were trapped on the north coast at a place on the north coast of France called Dunkirk. Their only hope against annihilation or having to surrender to the Nazis was to escape across the English Channel from France into Great Britain. And so a massive call went out in Britain for every ship that was able to sail to go to Dunkirk to begin the massive evacuation of Allied soldiers. And 861 ships, including this very small boat that only seated a couple of soldiers and was actually powered mostly by rowing, ended up rescuing 338,000 soldiers from Dunkirk. But because those soldiers had left, France quickly falls to the Nazis. And after only 43 days, on June 22nd, 1940, France surrenders to the Nazis. And so at this point, Great Britain was the last major country opposing the Axis powers. In France, a French resistance forms, but ultimately the Nazis are going to control France for most of the war. And Hitler, true to form, demanded that the French leaders surrender to the Nazi leaders in, yes, the exact same rail car that Germany had surrendered to the Allies in the First World War. Thus, in his mind, probably undoing that fatal armistice. Once the Nazis capture France, Adolf Hitler himself visits and tours Paris, taking a very iconic photo of himself in front of the Eiffel Tower. And so at this point, in June of 1940, Great Britain now stood alone against all of the might of the Axis powers, and they would soon be put to the test in the largest aerial battle in mankind's history up to that point.